Welcome. I'm Suzanne Spaulding, Senior Advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I lead the Defending Democratic Institutions project. And we are so honored today to have such a dedicated public servant, our former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, here for an important conversation about a recent survey that the Panetta Institute conducted and about the state of our democracy and what can be done to engage young people to be the engaged citizens that we need to preserve our democracy going forward. Secretary Panetta really hardly needs an introduction, but I'm going to quickly recap his amazing career. As you all know, he served under several administrations. He served as Secretary of Defense, but also before that, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was White House Chief of Staff. He was Director of the Office of Management and Budget. And of course, he was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from California for 16 years. He was reelected 8 times. His distinguished career in public service also included serving as an officer in the Army Military Intelligence Corps, where he received the Army Commendation Medal. Secretary Panetta and his wife Sylvia co-founded the Panetta Institute for Public Policy at the University of California, California State University, in 1997. When he retired as Secretary of Defense in 2013, he went back and serves now as chairman of that institute. The institute is dedicated to motivating and preparing people for lives of public service and helping them to become more knowledgeably engaged in the democratic process. For those of you who are watching us through the CSIS events page, I want to note that you can ask questions, push the question button and submit your questions in writing, and we'll get to those at the end of our conversation. Mr. Secretary, it's an honor to have this opportunity to talk with you about the work of the Institute and its most recent survey and the state of our democracy. So let's start with the decision that you and your wife Sylvia made to establish this Institute on Public Policy. You must have had lots of options and thought about lots of different things you could do with your energy and your expertise. What was it that made you decide that this is where you really wanted to focus your energy?
Well, thank you, Suzanne, for hosting this program, and my thanks to CSIS and John Hammery for making this possible. Sylvia and I, my wife and I, came back after serving as Chief of Staff to Bill Clinton, and immediately were involved in teaching some classes at a university that I helped founded. Because it replaced the Fort Ord Military Reservation, California State University at Monterey Bay. And I began teaching there, and I taught at my alma mater at Santa Clara. And both my wife and I were very concerned that we did not see that interest in young people to get involved in public service, something that was true for my generation. As a result of that, we thought it was really important to try to establish an institute that would try to inspire young people to get involved in public service and get involved in our democracy. We developed a curriculum to try to meet that. We do a leadership course for student body officers. We do a congressional internship program in Washington. We do a lecture series. I even do a program, a fellows program, where I try to teach the art of governing, something that's a lost art these days, and really have these law students look at issues, give me the Republican viewpoint, give me the Democratic viewpoint, and then tell me what a compromise would look like. It's called governing in democracy. So we've got some great courses, and we are seeing the results of that as young people who are in our programs are now serving in Congress as aides. Some have run for Congress. Some are now serving here in California at the state legislature. So we're happy that we've been able to plant some seeds of future leadership for our democracy which we believe is important to having a future of our democracy.
That's just outstanding and so inspiring. And I wish we could clone this all across the country and have this happening in every community across the nation, because while you are clearly producing some really positive results here, we are not seeing this across the country. And your most recent survey on youth civic engagement has some very troubling information in it. And I know you started doing this survey in 2000, and this is your 23rd year of doing this survey. But you know, among the saddest things that I saw as I read over the results of your survey, I thought was that 70% of young people say that it's harder to achieve the American dream than it was for their parents' generation. In 2004, only 6% of those surveyed thought they would end up being worse off financially than their parents. In the most recent survey, that number was 42%, up from 6%. Also, among the most troubling findings, and perhaps related, the survey revealed that 71% of young people believe that the country is on the wrong track. What are your thoughts on these findings, Secretary, and what other findings in the survey really stood out to you?
Well, we've been doing this national survey for, as you pointed out, over 20 years. And we do it with Hart and Associates. And our purpose is to try to really find out where young people's attitudes are, not only towards democracy, but towards a number of issues as well. And this latest poll was very discouraging because it found that the student level of engagement and the desire to participate in our democracy is at historic lows. And the one that bothered me the most is the one that young people really did not think that they would be able to enjoy a better life than their parents, which is the American dream. And that particularly hurt me because, frankly, as the son of Italian immigrants, I remember asking my dad why they came all of that distance to come to this country. And I never forgot his answer. It was that my mother and he believed that they could give their children a better life in this country. That's the American dream. That's what we want for our children. And if they feel like they're not going to be able to enjoy that American dream, that's a significant finding that tells us that young people, for some reason now, are losing faith, not only in our democracy, but losing faith in their ability to succeed in life. And that's particularly concerning. Somehow, we have got to be able to inspire them to understand that that dream is real, that they can achieve it, and that we can have a better democracy.
Yeah, I do worry that there are lots of reasons, obviously, that there is a stronger sense of financial insecurity, and it's not just among young people. But I do worry that that there is a tendency to equate what they consider sort of the flaws of maybe rampant capitalism with democracy. I talked to a number of young people, and they who talk about how they prefer a socialist system, a socialism, as opposed to democracy. And I have to point out to them that socialism is really an economic model, and democracy, and there are democracies that have more socialistic economic models. But I do think that there is a sense that democracy is failing to meet the needs of its people in so many ways. And so those two issues are not surprisingly connected. Your survey found that many young people just feel disconnected from democracy and uncertain about their role in democracy. Only 54% say democracy in America is working very or somewhat well. And 3/4 of those surveyed believe that democracy will not improve or will be worse in 10 years. How do we empower young people? I can't help but think that some of that is connected to their uncertainty about the roles of the three branches of government and how democracy is supposed to work. How do we empower young people to have a greater role and an understanding of their role and sense of their ability to influence things going forward?
Well, that's the question that you know, the Panetta Institute is looking at very closely, because it really does relate to our future as a democracy. I mean, our democracy depends on future generations of leaders that embrace our democracy and are able to not only do their duty to the country, but also understand that they can make a difference. They can make a difference, and that is really the fundamental principle of our democracy, is that we can make a difference in people's lives. Look, there's no silver bullet here. I wish there were, but there's a combination of things that I think we need to pay attention to. One is that I have to tell you, I teach a lot of students who come through the Panetta Institute. I do not believe they are as grounded as they should be in our democracy. And I think part of that is the education process. When I was in high school, I was required to take for college prep courses in problems in democracy, in the Constitution, in history, in understanding how our democracy is supposed to function. And as a matter of fact, in order to graduate from high school, this is a public school in those days, you had to pass a Constitution test. That's no longer required. And so what I'm finding is that young people who come to the Panetta Institute, and we have a congressional internship program where we're going to send them back to Washington to work with members of Congress. I've got to spend time teaching them about our democracy, how laws are made. And look, I understand the problem. There are members of Congress who don't know quite how laws are made these days. So I can understand young people feeling that way, but I think part of this is the role of education. Part of it is the role model in democracy. Look, when I was young, I looked to Washington. There was a young president who said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." There were role models that I saw in Washington, and there aren't that many role models now that inspire young people to get involved in public service. And then add to that the dysfunction in Washington. If you're looking at a Washington that is not working together in order to govern the country, but rather fighting with each other in partisan divisions and divisiveness, that really does not look very good in terms of our democracy. As a matter of fact, it's creating frustration, not just among young people, but among the American people. And so you begin to combine all of that together, and you can understand why young people, for whatever reason, are not attracted to public service, not attracted to being part of our democracy. And somehow it's going to take a combination of efforts here to try to get them to understand that they have a duty to country. I mean, look, I'm a believer in duty to country. We taught our young sons, our three sons, that duty to country was important. That's what my parents taught me. Somehow we've got to get back to that. And you know, I've often said this, and I know it's going to be tough to do, but I really do think that this country needs a national service system in which young people, in some way, have to serve this country in some capacity, whether it's in education, whether it's in conservation, whether it's in helping the aged or some other areas, or in the military service. to be able to serve this country for 2 years and understand that the importance of duty to our democracy. Somehow we've got to be able to get young people to understand that they do have a duty to serve our nation.
Yeah, that notion of civic responsibility is just so crucial. When I was Undersecretary at Homeland Security, leading the men and women responsible for cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, I would often go around the country and speak to to communities, and I would always say, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. And I so often got blank looks back. And it suddenly dawned on me that part of what I was seeing there was that we have not really taught this sense of civic responsibility. But your point is so well taken that we need to both be teaching about democracy, and we need our institutions to be ready then to be responsive, to be accountable. Let's start with the civics piece. Your sense that you're getting students who need a primer on basic civics is spot on. The most recent national assessment of educational progress found that only 22% of eighth graders were proficient in civics. And that has been the case for many, many years. We turn out year after year after year, and very few of them get that then in high school either. And so they're coming out and either going into college or going into their communities without that grounding. And as I say, that's been happening for decades. Part of what we see as a result of that is an adult population that also needs to find ways to become more knowledge, to increase their civic knowledge, their civic skills, and their civic engagement. And at CSIS, we have been promoting something called Civics at Work to get businesses to step up to the role they can play in trying to strengthen that among our adult population. But higher education stepping up to this is also critically important. We launched a series called Civics as a National Security Imperative, and you have had much of your career in the national security realm and are a real expert in that. Do you agree that, there's so much talk of STEM being a national security imperative and priority, that civics ought to be on a par with STEM in terms of how we view the urgency and the importance of investing in reinvigorating civics education?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've been focusing on STEM for a long time, but the reality is that none of that works unless young people understand the role of our democracy and their role in our democracy. And the reality is that civics education provides that fundamental foundation in young people so that they understand that in order to be able to work in our democracy, they've got to be able to respect and understand the views of others. Look, our democracy does not function unless it's built on trust. I've often said that in my over 50 years of public life, I've seen Washington at its best, and I've seen Washington at its worst. The good news is I've seen Washington work. I was there at a time when Republicans and Democrats worked together. They worked together. They had their political differences, but when it came to big issues, they worked together. When I got elected to Congress, Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House, a Democrat from Boston. But he had a great relationship with Bob Michel, who was the minority leader from Illinois. Did they have their differences? Yes. But they really stressed that when it came to big issues, both parties have a responsibility to work together and to understand one another and to be able to trust one another and speak to one another. And the ability to do that which we had in those days, the ability to sit in a room and negotiate on some of the most critical issues was important in order to govern. I can remember during the Reagan administration, Republicans and Democrats worked on Social Security reform. Imagine, third rail of politics, but both sides were working together to do Social Security reform, and it passed with a bipartisan vote. We did immigration reform in those days, something Congress can't even begin to deal with for the last 20 years. But we did, and we negotiated, and we respected each other's views, and we passed it on a bipartisan vote. We did tax reform. We did budgets working together. So the ability to relate to one another, to listen, to respect their views, even if you disagree with them, but give them the opportunity to express their views so that you can ultimately find compromise. You can ultimately find consensus. That's what our democracy is built on. Goes back to our forefathers. Our democracy does not work if you just kind of assume that one party or one president could somehow dictate what happens. As a matter of fact, our forefathers said they don't want power centralized in any one branch of government. They don't want a king. They don't want a king parliament. They don't want a star chamber court. So they built this system of three separate but equal branches of government to be able to not only limit power, but give our democracy a chance for people to fully participate in governing our country. So civics education, the ability to understand the importance of working with others, the ability to understand that you can make a difference in our democracy if you participate, all of those things have to be restored so that young people can embrace the role they have to play in our democracy and not walk away from it.
Yeah. So let's pick up on your conversation about how Congress used to operate in a more bipartisan fashion. There have always been differences in the perspectives and viewpoints and ideologies between the two parties. That's part of the strength of our system. But the ability to find ways to move forward. My sense is that there are members on both sides of the aisle who would value that. And I think we saw that in the compromise that was worked out on immigration. It did not ultimately get enacted, but that there are some members. So maybe your thoughts on sort of how did we wind up where we are today? That's a big question. But perhaps more importantly, how can we make sure, how can we move forward in a way that Congress steps up to its important role as a check and balance, as an independent branch of government, and its role in being a constructive body that conducts bipartisan oversight and where appropriate legislation, and certainly appropriation of funds and keeping the government going. How do we get back there?
Suzanne, I tell the students at the Panetta Institute that in our democracy, we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If leadership is there and willing to make the tough decisions associated with leadership, and as we all know, if you're going to be a leader, you're going to have to take risks. You're going to have to take chances. You may offend people that support you. But if you're doing what's right for the country, that's leadership. If we have that kind of leadership, we can avoid crisis, certainly contain it. But if that leadership isn't there, we'll govern by crisis. And for the last 20 or more years in Washington, we've largely governed by crisis. Nothing exemplifies that better than the budget process. I mean, when I was in Congress, I was chair of the Budget Committee. We passed budget resolutions. It was the law. They haven't passed a budget resolution in over 20 years. We passed appropriations bills, oftentimes by October 1, which is what you're supposed to do. They haven't done that for over 20 years as well. So what they wind up doing, because they aren't obviously exercising fiscal discipline, is they wind up going with a continuing resolution to keep the government funded. And even passing that is oftentimes difficult to do because they know it's a crisis, because they know if they don't pass a CR, they're going to shut the government down. So they have to operate with that axe over their head. And that really does undermine the process that should take place. Look, I have a son who's in Congress, who actually is in my seat in the Congress, Jimmy. And he served in the military during Afghanistan. And he saw in my day the work we did working together with Republicans, going out to dinner, going on trips together, developing good relationships. And he thought it was important for Congress to get back to that. There is a group called the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House, made up of, I believe, 20, almost 30 members from the Republican side and 30 from the Democratic side. And they are trying to work together. They're trying to develop compromise together, and they have been successful at doing some of that. So there is, I think, among a number of members, the desire not to simply confront one another, not simply to block one another, but to actually work together to try to deal with the problems that face this country. It's a national security issue. And the reason it's a national security issue is because if our democracy isn't working to solve issues like immigration, to solve issues like the budget and the debt, to solve issues like healthcare and other needs in this society, it weakens our country. It weakens our country. And so in order to be able to show that our democracy is strong, both Republicans and Democrats have to be willing to work together, to be able to sit down, to find compromise, to find consensus, and to place nation above party. That is critical. It can't just be about the party. It can't just be about politics. It has to be about how do we solve the issues that are confronting the American people. And until we get back to that, you know, you can put a lot of money in defense, you can put a lot of money in other areas of national security, but the most fundamental area, the ability to govern our democracy, is going to fail. I've often said we can go one of two ways in this country. We can go towards an America in Renaissance. We've got a strong economy. Our fundamentals are good. We could teach our kids the skills of the future. Republicans and Democrats could work together. We could have world leadership in a dangerous world. We could have that kind of America. But if we allow our fears and our hates and our divisions and our partisanship to eat us alive, then we'll be an America in decline, and we'll go the way of past empires, because past empires died because they lost the ability to lead. So that's what we've got to inspire, is bold leadership that is willing to find consensus and willing to work together to do what our democracy needs most of all, which is to govern, to govern.
Yeah, and if you needed any more evidence that this threatens the security of our country and that this division makes us weaker, you need only look to what our adversaries are doing to exploit those divisions. They know, they understand better than most Americans perhaps do, how this divisiveness weakens us and does undermine the ability to govern. It undermines our ability to mobilize in the way that we could as a nation to meet all the challenges that we face. And it's been a core part of my work at CSIS to understand better how our adversaries, and particularly Russia, but also China and Iran and other countries are getting involved in trying to manipulate the public discourse in our country to exacerbate divisions. There's a lot of focus, as you know, on the horse race around elections and our country's interfering on behalf of one candidate or another. And we sort of had that in this last election. Iran was assessed to be coming in against Trump, and Russia was assessed to be trying to interfere in ways that helped former President-elect Trump. But what everyone agrees on, who looks at this from the government and outside the government, is that our adversaries share a common objective that transcends elections, and that is to deepen our divisions and to undermine trust in our democratic institutions. I'm very concerned that in the face of our adversaries really stepping up their game in that propaganda world, we are unilaterally disarming. And I don't know if you have views on the role of the government in understanding and countering foreign disinformation. But there's talk today of getting rid of the office at the State Department that is responsible for helping us understand this threat. There's a lot of pressure on institutions inside and outside the government to stop working on understanding this threat. And are you concerned about this? And what do you see as the role of our adversaries in exploiting these weaknesses of our own making?
Well, look, we have to look at the big picture, and the big picture is clearly a conflict between autocracy on one hand and autocrats on one hand, and democracy. And autocrats, their interest, Putin's basic interest is to undermine the strength of the United States. I've followed Putin for a long time, particularly in the intelligence area. And there's one fundamental thing that drives Putin, which is to undermine the strength of the United States. And so they do that. They spend their time providing disinformation, trying to divide America. China does the same thing. Iran does the same thing. North Korea tries to do some of the same things. So autocrats spend their time trying to undermine democracy. Putin marched into Ukraine for one reason, because he did not believe people of Ukraine had the right to determine how to govern themselves. And so he marched into a democracy, a sovereign democracy. And terrorists like Hamas, attacked Israel because they don't like the existence of a democracy like Israel in the Middle East. And Xi in China threatens Taiwan, another democracy. And so there is a very real threat to our democracy. And democracy feeds in to what autocrats are saying if we can't govern. If democracies have a problem working together to govern, that gives autocrats the fuel to basically show the world that it's autocrats who can govern. When the reality is that's not the case. We saw Assad finally step down as the dictator in Syria. Why? Because he failed. He failed, and he killed a number of innocent people in Syria. And that's what autocrats do. That's how they govern. We believe in our values of freedom and the dignity of the individual and the ability to self-govern, the ability to enjoy our freedoms and our liberties. Those are fundamental values. But if we cannot work together to govern in our democracy and allow these autocrats to be able to undermine our ability to work together, which is what they're doing. This disinformation feeds into social media. We started talking about how young people are impacted. What we found in our poll is that they now, over 70% get their information from social media. It's not television, it's not the newspaper, it's social media. And that's exactly what disinformation focuses on, is impacting on social media. So they're feeding this stuff to young minds. And that's what produces some of the results that we saw in our poll. It's feeding into that. So yes, this is going to be a huge conflict in the 21st century, which is to determine which form of government, whether it's autocracy or democracy, is going to not only survive, but best represent the hopes and dreams of people. And guess what? It's up to each of us. It's up to each of us to be able to make that happen. I mean, that's what I try to emphasize with young people is that if they don't like what's going on, they ought to jump in and make a difference. They ought to jump in and make a difference. Because the one thing I learned is that if you get involved, if you build coalitions, if you vote against people who don't do what you want, that's democracy in action. And that's how you change the future of our country and make a difference in people's lives, is by getting involved. And that has always worked in our democracy. And if young people think that they don't have to work at that, they don't have to roll up their sleeves and get involved, that's the surest way to weaken our democracy in the future.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And yet, I think it is such a challenge to sustain that, not just with young people, but with adults as well. But we'll focus on young people who perhaps have just begun to focus on politics and policy, who perhaps got engaged in this most recent election for the first time, maybe at the local level, state level, federal level, national level, and their candidate didn't win. So, I always think we need to talk more about the day after the election, right? That getting engaged and getting involved is not just about working to get your candidate elected, but that there's so much more that can be done and must be done starting the day after the election, particularly at your community and local level. How do we talk to those young people who may be devastated that their candidate at whatever level didn't get elected, and therefore the system is broken, and they just can't go through that again, and so they disengage. I know adults who are feeling the same way, but how do you talk to them and encourage them to stay involved, to keep at it, to bring about change?
Well, it really goes to the essence of what our democracy is all about. The fact is that no one election is forever. And we've been through elections where we sometimes wonder what the hell happened in our democracy. But it is our democracy. It's what our democracy is all about. Are those who can bring a message to the American people and are able to convince them that they're trying to do the right thing for the country, and they understand the people's frustrations and anger and economic conditions that may be impacting on our people. So the ability to kind of reach the people, understand what they're concerned about, and deliver a positive message about what needs to be done, that is what our democracy is all about. And if you fail to do that, you lose. You lose. But it doesn't mean you lose forever. What you have to do is learn from every election. What is it that you need to do in order to be able to reach the average American? I think that's something, we've kind of forgotten in politics. Politics has been this approach now where you look at different sectors of the voting public, whether it's women, or whether it's racial minorities, or whether it's people who are workers or people on the right. And we've segmented our society up into, different elements of the voting base. When the reality is, the message should go to the average American. Look, I've been to red states, I've been to blue states. The fact is that families in the red state and families in the blue state share the same concerns. They're worried about educating their kids. They're worried about getting a home. They're worried about getting a job. They're worried about security. They're worried about health care. They have the same concerns. And it's the ability to reach that average citizen, to understand what their concerns are, that really makes the difference as to who wins or loses an election. So what we try to do with young people is say, look, one election does not determine the rest of history. It doesn't. 2 years ago, we had a different election. 4 years ago, we had a different election. We elected a different person. And in 2 years and 4 years, we'll elect different members of the Congress, and we'll elect a new president. That's the great part of our democracy, is that you never lock it in. It is not a dictatorship. It is not an autocracy. It's the ability to choose new leaders, the ability to cast your vote, to make a difference. I mean, that's the other thing I try to, convince young people, is that their ability to vote does make a difference. If they turn out and they vote, they can impact on who's elected and what happens in terms of issues. But they've got to participate. If they don't participate, others will, who represent a different viewpoint, and they'll win. So somehow they have to know that hope is eternal if you're willing to work at it. If you're willing to again, roll up your sleeves, get involved with issues, build coalitions, threaten people in office that they'll get voted out if they don't respond to their needs. And believe me, if you're an elected official, that's the one way you pay attention, is if there are coalitions of people who say, if you don't do what we want, we're going to vote against you. And they've got to activate that kind of approach if they're going to make a difference in terms of what happens in our democracy. There is hope. I mean, the one thing that I've always thought about in my years of public service is that in the different jobs I've had, if I can make a difference in the lives of people, for example, when I was in Congress, I was able to enact legislation that created the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. We protected our coastline off the Central Coast. That's an important goal. That's an important achievement. If we can do that for healthcare, if we can do it for education, if we can do it for national security, we can make our country better for the future. And frankly, the goal of public service is to make people's lives better, to allow that American dream to be able to take effect. So, it isn't just a game of, kind of sitting back like you're watching television or watching a football game. It really is not a spectator sport. It means you've got to jump up and go to the field and get involved. That's the way it works in a democracy.
Yeah, I always say that the promise of democracy is not some myth of current perfection, which doesn't exist, but its capacity to change. That's what distinguishes democracy from authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, is that capacity to change. But that change is only going to happen if we are the informed and engaged agents of that change. And your survey was had so many things that were disheartening, and yet I think this is a generation of young people who care deeply about the world and want to help improve it. But I was really struck by the list of entities that the respondents to the survey believe are hurting democracy. Congress, 53% of those believe that Congress is ultimately hurting democracy rather than helping it, that the Supreme Court, by 54%, is hurting democracy, and that media outlets like television networks and newspapers, 58%, say they are hurting democracy.
Yeah.
So, to the point of being agents of change, I think one of the things to sort of talk to young people about who are maybe frustrated with elections is you can join coalitions and reform organizations to hold institutions accountable, right? If you are unhappy with the state of media today, find out about how to strengthen, what are the things that are being done to strengthen local news organizations that are generally trusted more by the public, right? If you are frustrated and mistrusting, as the latest Gallup survey results out today show, a dramatic decline in trust in our courts and the sense of the rule of law that is so fundamental to our democracy. We've had a 24-point decline in the past 4 years in trust in our courts and our justice system. That is really, really troubling. There are judicial reform groups out there all across the country. If you are frustrated with the state of our justice system, get involved, right? Get engaged with these reform efforts. If you're frustrated with Congress, get involved, find out how you can, if you care about issues, your ability, Congressman, to pass this legislation was dependent, I'm sure, on support from your constituents and coalitions out there who helped push for this. There are so many other ways to become engaged, I think, in the process.
Yeah, we talked about the poll. One of the real areas of concern in the poll was the fact that young people, even though they understand what the three branches of government are, they really don't have a clear understanding of what the role is. By margins of 77%, 79%, and 80%, they said they do not understand what the executive, judicial, and legislative branches do. Imagine. That's almost 3/4, 2/3 of these young people do not understand what the very checks and balances that we have in a democracy, what they're all about. And so, the importance of their understanding how the courts are supposed to function, how the executive branch is supposed to function, how the legislative branch is supposed to function, how the press is supposed to function as a check and balance in our democracy. That's critical to our ability to make sure that power never gets centralized in one branch of government. That's what limits power. And ultimately, I know our forefathers probably didn't think a lot about this, but when you create the system of checks and balances, you can create some gridlock in a democracy because you've got a lot of checks and balances that can prevent things from happening. But the key to breaking that deadlock in their minds was the ability of elected leaders to have that dialogue, to be able to work together to make sure that our democracy functioned and to make sure that they could govern in our democracy. I mean, our forefathers placed trust in elected leaders who would exercise their own ability to influence what happened in our democracy and to be a part of that. And that's what in many ways we're asking young people to do, is to recognize your role in making change in our democracy. You don't like what's going on, you can make a change. That's a reality. You can make a change. If you don't like how somebody's serving you in Congress, you can make you can make a change. You can make a difference. If you don't like what a president's doing, you can make a difference. You can make a difference. That's the great thing about our democracy, is that we aren't stuck in a hole. We have the ability to make that happen. I mean, the one thing I recognized in my 50 years of public service is that I had a chance to really influence people's lives. The fact was that as chairman of the budget committee, and then when I became director of the Office of Management and Budget, not only President Bush, but President Clinton were willing to deal with the deficits at that time in order to make sure that we exercise fiscal discipline. So we passed huge agreements between Republicans and Democrats that reduced the deficit. Tough decisions on spending, on entitlements, on taxes. And we passed it in the Bush administration and we passed it in the Clinton administration. And guess what? As a result of that, we helped balance the federal budget. Imagine now, the fact that we not only balanced it, but we had a surplus. And today we have a $35 or $36 trillion debt, and neither party has any interest, frankly, in dealing with those issues. So young people need to understand that they can make a difference in whether or not those we elect deal with the problems that face our country. And if we can encourage that kind of leadership that's willing to take risks and do what's right, I'm convinced that our country can really be a country in renaissance in the 21st century.
Yeah. And so much of that is dependent upon an understanding of technology. Technology is going to be such an important part of that. And one of the things that I worry a bit about is that we've got people making policy who don't understand technology. And we've got technology innovators and leaders who don't understand policy and the role of government and how we bring those together. And we talked a little bit about the importance of STEM education to our national security, the importance of civics to our national security. I think it's critically important that we bring these things together. We recently did a study and issued a report on building civics concepts into STEM education and into the tech sector to try to make sure that our folks who are tech savvy some of them are inspired to go into public service, so that we've got folks making these important decisions and understanding how our adversaries use technology against us, for example, but also all of the tremendous potential, as you talk about this renaissance that our country could achieve, that we've got informed policymakers and that we've got folks in the tech sector who have that sense of civic responsibility and perhaps think more carefully about the impact of their work on their communities and on the world. Again, this idea that you can make a change if you understand. Does the Panetta Institute have the ability to kind of cross disciplines like that? I know that's famously difficult in academia.
It is, but we do spend time on issues like artificial intelligence. One of the things I wanted to mention is the survey that we did showed a surge in the use of artificial intelligence on campus. Last year, 60% of college students reported using a chatbot. That amount has now risen to 74%. 74% are using artificial intelligence chatbot. And that means that technology is there. And I think in some ways it puts even greater responsibility on all of us, because as we develop new technologies, like artificial intelligence, like robotics, like cyber. We have got to also be able to make sure that young people are also learning how to deal with that they control it. It's not just a tool that you can let go wild. You've got to deal with it. You've got to be responsible for what happens with it. And what we try to do is, because we're close to Silicon Valley, is to bring people down from Silicon Valley who are talking about new developments in technology, who are talking about the future, and also emphasizing for young people not only the development of that technology, but their responsibility as students, as young people, to be able to control that kind of technology for the future as well.
Yeah, yeah. Again, that sort of sense of that we are all responsible, right? We have some responsibility that extends beyond ourselves, and that's what we bring to our sense of public service, right? A sense of belonging. The wonderful thing about public service is the sense of being part of something bigger than yourself, and I think young people are thirsty for that, and I'm so grateful to you, Secretary, for the role that you and Sylvia have played in establishing this institute and guiding young people for decades now, in helping to inspire them to be part of that governance, part of that broader mission, if you will. And I thank you for everything that you have done in your own career and that you are doing in the Institute. I often, when I speak, talk about the fact that as a big baseball fan, I'm a Nationals fan here in Washington, that I hear the national anthem, quite frequently. I go to a lot of ball games, and some years ago, it struck me that national anthem starts with a question and it ends with the same question. It never answers the question, right? It starts with, can you see? Because it's written on the eve of a battle, big battle in 1812, and the flag was flying over the fort. Through the night, they could see it as the rockets went off, but the battle has ended, and it's been quiet for a while, and the dawn is breaking, the sun is just coming up, and they don't know who won. And they ask, does the flag still fly over the land of the free and the home of the brave? And I think it is a challenge to each and every one of us every day to do what we can to make sure that the answer to that question is yes, that we continue to be the republic that holds those values, and lives up to the aspirations of the Constitution. And I'm so grateful for everything you do to make that a reality.
Well, Suzanne, thank you very much, and thanks for this opportunity. I think Sylvia and I, in some way, believe that what we're doing at the Institute is trying to really establish a new generation of leaders for our country, and that's our investment in democracy. It's our investment in our future as well. Is to make sure that we have a new generation of young leaders. And man, do we need a new generation of young leaders who are interested in our democracy and interested in making it better. So I really do think that if all of the people who are listening to this program understand that they too can make a difference in trying to influence young people just by who they are, and the fact that if they show confidence that you can make our democracy work, young people pay attention to that. And that means that all of us have to be part of this fight for a better America.
Amen. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.